on tonight's show, we asked former U.S. Attorney Guy Lewis why it's so hard to prove election fraud in court. And the LA Police Department is closing its sexual assault unit as it implements its defund the police budget. So, as things currently stand, President Trump would need to gain 3 states in order to win this election. And right now, there are lawsuits pending, sometimes multiple ones, in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada. There's also a recount underway in Georgia and one potentially in Wisconsin. So it's a high bar to reach. And at the same time, though, evidence and affidavits continue to pile up with the Trump campaign's team of lawyers. But what will it take to actually prove election fraud and flip the results in enough states to win, which is presumably the end game for President Trump and many of his 71 million supporters? Guy Lewis is a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida, and he can help us answer some of that. Guy, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here, Cindy. Thanks.
So, as I said in the intro, there's a lot of suits pending, and a lot of the experts say, despite the mounting evidence, and there is evidence, is it enough to prove that there's election fraud and flip results? So, what does it take to actually prove it in court?
So, great question. If this was a typical fraud type case, of course you'd have to bring in witnesses, not just affidavits. You'd have to bring in eyewitness testimony, not just hearsay testimony. In other words, hey, somebody told me that they saw X, Y, or Z, some bad things going on in the county process. Now, in addition, I think what I'm looking for is documentary evidence as well, not just eyewitness testimony. Documentary evidence, for example, ballots that were cast for one party or another, in this case for Trump, but were actually tallied toward Biden's results in the state. And the problem really where we are right now, Cindy, is that, as you know, each state has their own process. Each state now has, especially the razor-thin states, have either recounts or lawsuits, and we're up to, I've lost count, to be perfectly honest, dozens and dozens of state and federal lawsuits that are currently pending.
So here's my question. To prove it, does it actually have to prove that fraud existed, or that there was enough fraud that it altered the results of the election? What actually has to be proven, and what would be the next step?
Well, that's, again, terrific question, because you better believe the judge looks down at the Trump lawyers and actually says, okay, counsel, what are you asking me to do? What is it you are seeking? What remedy? And again, there's no easy answer here. In some cases, and the reason why this looks sort of like a shotgun approach is because it is. In some cases, you're actually saying, Judge, stop the counting. Quit counting. In other cases, you're saying, Judge, continue the counting that's coming in. In other cases, you're saying, the Trump lawyers are saying, look, let's separate the good from the bad and only count what we suggest to you is the good. So that makes it, to be honest with you, even more confusing in terms of trying to, I guess, create this narrative that, hey, it is, as I think as Trump said either yesterday or early today, I think he said something like this, you know, the election is corrupt and the most corrupt election in recent history. And, you know, he's to be honest with you, he's creating for himself a very high bar in terms of the public narrative.
So will the judges be looking for, what would be the end game of a case? That there's a new election, that everything is recounted? What would be the possible end games that the team's looking for?
Well, let's take a recent example. There's not a lot of, you know, lawyers love precedent, We love to look at other examples. Let's look at briefly Bush v. Gore. 2000 election happened down here in my home state of just a few miles up the road from Miami, mainly up in Palm Beach and Broward counties. You'll remember it because that was the one where the judge was holding up, trying to look at the hanging Chad and figure out what was the voters' intent. That was an easy one. And I'm sort of avoiding your question, but I'm not completely avoiding your question. That was an easier one because Florida was razor thin. I mean, there was, I don't know, several hundred, 300 or 400 vote difference. And so they were trying to get a number of votes both thrown out and the count stopped the way they were doing it in Palm Beach. And of course, it went up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, that's enough. Quit counting Florida. Who's ahead right now? Just happened to be George Bush, and they gave him the election, of course. In this case, it's a little different. It's a little harder because Trump is basically using both procedure and procedural errors in terms of, hey, for example, Texas and other places arguing that, hey, you can't drive through and vote in a drive-through, or you can't extend it. Pennsylvania, big win today. You can't extend the number of days to continue to collect the ballots via a judicial mandate. It's got to be a legislative enactment. And so Trump people had a big win today. So you've got that procedural sort of a technique that they're using. But at some point, that's going to pivot into a sort of substantive factual inquiry where you say, because the judge really, if it's I don't know, Georgia is what right now, about 14,000 vote difference.
Right.
And so the judge is going to look down, as you're suggesting, saying, hey, okay, other side, they'll agree that 100, 200, these 300 ballots, but you're going to have to come up with something close to 14,000 to be able to say, hey, judge, throw out these votes, and we win the state.
So what about all the cases where meaningful access was denied, and so nobody would have been there to observe if there was fraud? Like, so Rudy Giuliani, Trump's personal lawyer, said 650,000 ballots were cast in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, which weren't observed by Republican poll watchers. So what about that kind of situation where you don't know if something, fraudulent happened because you weren't there to see it?
So the likely, my suggestion that the likely result, if they can actually prove it, because I believe the other side is contesting both that number and contesting the fact that meaningful access was denied. But again, that's a factual issue that the judge is going to have to resolve. Assuming she resolves it in favor of the Trump team, then look, what would be the likely remedy? You'd say go back and recount that 650,000 votes. And that seems like a reasonable solution if, in fact, they prove up. One thing to say it, another thing to prove it. If they prove up that 650,000, that procedural defect occurred, and we didn't get to inspect, we being the Trump people, didn't get to oversee the process regarding 650,000 votes.
Do you think the judges will put measures in place, or there'll be enough scrutiny that we couldn't have the situation where something's prescribed but it's not followed through? Just like, the poll watchers that weren't allowed to go in and watch, even though, they were given a court order to do that. Do you think that's a possibility?
I think it's possible. And I think what's likely is that these procedural flaws, these allegations of procedural flaws that are coming out of, say, Pennsylvania, for example, saying that the time for accepting mail-in ballots was extended, they say, Trump people say arbitrarily, without the blessing of the legislature. Those are in that case, by the way, Cindy, that's the case that's still pending, albeit dormant for right now. The Supreme Court said we can't do it on an expedited basis. So that actual case is still pending in the Supreme Court. Those procedural kind of flaws, I think, have right now a better chance of prevailing. And if that's the case, my prediction is that procedural flaw will then pivot and say, the lawyers will come in and say, okay, fine, now let's see what that procedural violation, how many votes that may have affected. And therein lies the answer to the really the million-dollar question is, even if I ruled in your favor, would that change anything? Would there be any difference in result?
But they won't know that, of course, unless they go back and look at all those ballots, right?
Bingo. You got it.
So that would have to happen. What about situations like, okay, looking ahead a little bit to the Georgia elections, runoff elections, and some prominent Democrats, including Andrew Yang and some other people, are saying, everyone move to Georgia before the deadline so you can register to vote. What do you make of situations like that from a fraud legal perspective?
Well, to me, that almost invites a fraud type analysis. You know, anytime, whether it's in the electoral process, and there's not many of these kind of cases. When I was U.S. Attorney down here, we used to get them all the time around the election period, where one candidate or another would come in and say, oh, all this fraud's going on. The other side is doing all these nefarious things and dead people voting and all this kind of stuff. Well, the Department of Justice's general guidelines on it were to stay out of it for this very reason, is that it's very difficult to prove. There's not many cases of it. And even if you can prove up a fraud type allegation, you basically have to go that next step and say, okay, what is your remedy? Again, in Bush v. Gore, it was easy. It was just stop the analysis, stop the count, and stop the recounts, and declare Bush the winner.
So
that's not where we are in this case.
let me ask you, this is the last question because we've got to wrap up, but in Bush v. Gore, Anthony Scalia talked about, he cited irreparable harm and that continuing to count would cause needless and unjustified cloud over Bush's legitimacy as president. And that's why they ordered the counting to stop. So what about that? It seems like there's a big cloud over this election. Do you think that kind of reasoning will come into play at any point?
I do, Cindy. I think that it will. And I think where we are in terms of the fundamentals of your question is the states really aren't required to certify their results for what? Another couple weeks, 12 days, 2 weeks, the middle of December. Again, each state is slightly different, but it's about the middle of December. And so I think just like Hillary Clinton objected to the election results, she litigated part of hers. Gore litigated part of his. I think the courts would generally allow Trump this process to play out. And then the rubber is going to hit the road about the middle of December when the states are required by law to start certifying their election results. And then we have to move forward one way or the other.
All right. Well, I guess we'll see what happens then. Maybe we can invite you back and talk some more about it then. Thank you so much for joining us today. And coming up after the break, the LA Police Department has announced it's closing its sexual assault unit. That's as it seeks to implement a $150 million defunding decision. But first, here's America Q&A.
Not really. I do have a friend that have different views from me.
Not really, because I'm not getting into a really deep politics things.
No, sir. No, sir. I personally, I just, if I'm asked by family members or what have you, what I think about it or whatever, I'll give them my 2 cents on it. But I'm rarely asked. I rarely engage in it. So, no, sir.
We disagree on things, but I think disagreement is healthy. And I mean, as long as my friends aren't trying to vote my rights away.
I do have family members that view things differently than I do. It hasn't caused too much stress because it hasn't been with my immediate family. There are certain people that I've met that, it is hard to look past at times. But these are people that I also don't encounter all the time. I'm in quite a, I should say, liberal bubble of my own.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to remind people that we're all Americans and that, regardless of who's, the president, we're still we're gonna do the same thing that we're doing. Our lives are not gonna drastically change right away type situation. So, but yeah, it's difficult with some people.
And welcome back. The Los Angeles Police Department is shutting down its sexual assault unit, and that's one that investigates complicated sex crimes like film producer Harvey Weinstein. It's the latest specialized unit to be affected in LA by the $150 million defunding decision passed by City Council and Mayor Eric Garcetti in July. The decision came amid protests and calls to defund the police in the wake of George Floyd's death in police custody in Minneapolis. LAPD Police Chief Michael Moore told NBC4 in LA that he had to immediately find 350 positions to cut, and more cuts are expected to come to meet those budget targets, and many have already been made as well. To help us understand why this is happening and what we can expect from police defunding policies, we're joined by Heather McDonald, a Manhattan Institute Fellow and author of the New York Times bestselling book, The War on Cops. Hello, Heather. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me on, Cindy. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate you joining us. So, George Floyd died on May 25th in police custody in Minneapolis. And in LA, they passed this defunding budget of $150 million on July 1st, which was about 5 weeks later, which doesn't sound like there was a lot of time to sort of ponder, look at the consequences, think it through. So I want to get your sense of your take of it. Well, what's driving these dynamics? Why are these decisions being made and made, perhaps hastily?
It's a mass hysteria, Cindy. The country has embraced a completely false narrative, which is that America is defined by white supremacy, and policing in particular is defined by white supremacy. That is an utter falsehood. Far from discriminating against blacks in this country, there's not a single mainstream institution that is not going out of its way to hire and promote as many so-called underrepresented minorities as possible. When it comes to policing, the idea that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police killings of black men is complete falsehood. In last year, there were 9 allegedly unarmed blacks who were killed by the police. That's out of 7,400 black homicide victims. That's 0.1% of all blacks who were killed by homicide were killed by a cop and allegedly unarmed. And I use that because the Washington Post is very generous in its definitions. The police are not the problem in this country. Crime is. But the country has been primed for the last 3 or 4 decades by a poisonous ideology coming out of the universities, identity politics that says that the most important thing about somebody is his sex and his melanin, and that whites are inherently racist and everybody else is apparently inherently oppressed. That narrative has now been embraced by corporations throughout the government, in every business establishment in the country, and in policing, it is having its most negative effects. The riots that we saw this summer were part of this in many ways. The cops backed off. The cops are now exhausted. They find themselves routinely assaulted, shot at, spit upon, cursed at whenever they try to do their jobs. They are exhausted with the riot duty. And these cutbacks are only resulting in more black lives being lost. Homicides are up 53% in a sample of 27 large cities just this summer. The victims overwhelmingly black. The cuts we're seeing in LA are happening everywhere. Now, there's something slightly delicious about the LAPD situation, because what you have now is 2 official victim groups at cross purposes. To be honest, Cindy, the sex assault detectives desk and bureau was a bit overstaffed because of feminist pressure. So they can probably do with a little fewer detectives allocated full time to domestic violence issues. However, the LAPD has also dismantled its elite unit that gets guns off the street. That's not just a defunding issue, it's the usual race issue that if you go after criminals and those criminals are black, it's the police fault. Nobody looks at the fact that, sorry, this is the reality of crime. The police are the messenger. We're blaming them for the fact that there are astronomically higher rates of black crime in this society. So the police cannot fight crime without having a disparate impact on blacks. The only way to avoid disparate impact in law enforcement is to get rid of criminal law enforcement entirely.
Wow. So, one of the impacts we're seeing, I guess, is increased crime, and the other one is a horrible morale situation among the police. I saw there was a survey by Thin Blue Line, which is the LAPD Protective League publication. And I mean, the morale situation is terrible. 90% of them responded that if they could retire today, they would. So what do you think that the horrible morale situation, what impact will that in itself have, do you think?
Well, recruiting is over, and nobody's going to go into this job when the first day you're on the job, you are a racist, and you have no way to get out from under that. But what's happening is, and we saw this in 2015 and 2016 with what I called the Ferguson effect in the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement, where cops were being told relentlessly by CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, academic leaders, Democratic politicians, that they were racist for trying to save lives in the minority community. They were racist for doing something called proactive policing, which is discretionary policing. The cops don't have to do it. It's taking their own initiative to get out of a cop car at 2 a.m. if they see a known gangbanger on a street corner hitching up his waistband as if he has a gun. A cop has two options. He can drive on by and wait for the next 911 call to come over his radio saying there's been a drive-by shooting, or he can get out of his car and ask that gangbanger a few questions. Well, if the cops are being told that it's racist to make those car stops, to make those pedestrian stops, policing is political, and they're not going to do it. And that's what happened in 2015 and 2016. We saw a massive drop in stops, and we saw another 2,000 black males being killed over 2015 and 2016 compared to the 2014 numbers. Right now, what I've called the Ferguson effect is now either Ferguson effect 2.0 or the Minneapolis effect, because this does grow out of the officer custody death of George Floyd. The crime increase that we're seeing now is of a rate and a magnitude and a speed that makes the Ferguson effect look like child's play. So the crime that is now overwhelmingly directed at blacks, there's been several dozen black children who have been killed in these insane drive-by shootings since George Floyd's death. About 4 dozen. Nobody has talked about them because you're not allowed to talk about black crime. The only thing that's going to stop this is if white kids start getting shot in drive-by shootings. Then the nation will pay attention. But if it's a black kid shot by a black criminal, doesn't fit the narrative, the media don't give a damn, and there has not been a single Black Lives Matter protest about the loss of a 1-year-old boy shot in his front yard, sleeping in his bed, sitting in a car with his father. These things are happening on a regular basis. Nobody hears about it.
So what do you think is going to happen as things, as the chaos and the crime get worse and worse? Do you think at some point the brakes will get put on? We'll go in the opposite direction? Is this just a spiral down? Where do you see this going?
Eventually, the pendulum should swing. That's what we saw in New York City with the election of Rudolph Giuliani in 1994. That was an utterly transformative moment. Nobody believed that New York was salvageable. It was assumed that the state of New York was inherently to live with violence, street squalor, and anarchy. Giuliani stepped up to the plate, brought in his first police commissioner, William Bratton, and they showed, no, you enforce the law, people pay attention. It's very simple. You enforce the law. You do not allow yourself to get mau-maued by claims of racism. You enforce the law. So things can turn around, but they're going to have to get a heck of a lot worse than they are right now. And they will get worse because it's not just a policing problem. You have these left-wing prosecutors across the country who are refusing to prosecute theft, shoplifting, loitering, turnstile jumping, because again, what's the problem? Disparate impact on blacks. If you want to understand what's going on in this country, it's all about disparate impact. We have got to get away from that idea. We have to say colorblind processes matter. The issue is behavior. If you are enforcing the law neutrally, and some groups have higher rates of criminal behavior, the solution is not to stop enforcing the law, it's to address those behaviors. And when it comes to black crime, the thing that has to be talked about first and foremost is reconstructing the family. Because right now, these young black males are not being civilized. They're growing up without a marriage norm in their culture. They don't have fathers, but they're not expected to engage in the most basic responsibility that any young boy has, which is to marry the mother of his children, or not go around serially impregnating women. Right now, that norm is broken down, and these kids are absolute wild men.
So do you think, I thought it was interesting that the, Minneapolis Police Department, where this wave of things started, has just asked for another $500,000 for more police to bring in from the outside because of this surge in crime. So do you think maybe some of the cities the city councils were passing these budgets, and they're the ones, who are directly impacted, see the problems. Do you think they'll turn around and implement different policies?
I hope so, but their ideology is a very powerful thing. And over the summer, the Times ran a hilarious article about a place in Minneapolis called Powderhorn Park, which has always been kind of edgy, somewhat gentrifying, with these white liberals, but very left wing. And they all had made pledges that they were never going to call the police because that would be racist, because again, disparate impact. And they interviewed people who'd been robbed, and they didn't call the police. They would rather be robbed than have any kind of law enforcement directed at the black kids who are, now have a carte blanche to do whatever they want. So we see this in New York City as well, with a lot of communities that are now having terrible homeless problems. There is some revolt, but there's also a large number of people who think that, oh no, this is wonderful. We can show compassion by letting people on the streets. You're not showing compassion by pulling back on the police, because I make a point, Cindy, of talking to those thousands of law-abiding residents of high crime communities, black, good bourgeois, hardworking citizens who beg for more police protection. They deserve that. They deserve safety. They deserve to be able to walk their streets without fear, just like everybody else takes for granted. And when these left-wing councils and these left-wing prosecutors say, we're not going to prosecute black criminals because that would be racist, it's the good law-abiding blacks who are hurt the most.
Right.
But as I say, it's going to have to spread to the white community for this to change more.
All right, we've got to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us today, Heather, and I hope you'll come back.
Thank you.